Hello, time for another vlog of sorts. I was reading this week about consciousness in animals in New Scientist magazine, actually an old article, but I was reading it. And it just seemed interesting, and I thought I'd talk about it, really. Because, I mean, first of all, we don't really know what consciousness is beyond its vague definition of something to do with awareness of stuff. We don't know how it works at all. I mean, mechanically, assuming it's some sort of electromechanical, chemical process. This is an assumption, because we can't measure it, because we don't know what it is or what it's made of, right? But we can measure, maybe, proxies for it. Things, particularly in the case of brain activity, that we think must be associated with consciousness, so that a conscious being would have this and a non-conscious one wouldn't. And it's interesting to note that biologists are thinking about consciousness in animals, because they're trying to work out how did it evolve, where did it develop from, is it more primitive in primitive creatures, and so on. So this is less what is it, and more what can we measure, which is a very scientific way to approach things, really. Now obviously, up until really quite recently, and still now, a lot of people actually hold the belief that animals are not conscious. It's especially self-serving belief. That is, people whose job it is to murder or torture animals tend to hold the belief that the animals don't feel it, or it doesn't matter in some way. Yes, we're predators, we're meat eaters, we have to. Well, some people say we can get away without doing it, but it's actually quite difficult, especially for a large population like us. But probably, I think humans will become more vegetarian inclined as time goes on. On the other hand, some scientists and some companies even are working on growing meat in vats, which would be fine. I would prefer that to killing animals. I like animals, after all, not just to eat. But I do believe, in common with the common sense view of most people, that animals do have awareness, consciousness, or whatever we want to call it. Certainly the higher animals do. It's pretty obvious that dogs and cats and horses and critters like that do. And biologists are wondering just how far does it go, and how similar is it to ours. It's a bit difficult, as I say, because we don't really understand the whole thing at all, nor how it might work. But there are, as I say, proxies that biologists measure, and I thought I'd just go through some of these out of interest, really. The one we've probably all heard about is the mirror test. You stick a mirror up in front of a being, a creature, and you see if it can recognise itself. So, for example, chimps pass this test straight away. You might secretly put a little blob of paint on his forehead or something that he doesn't know about because you were distracting him at the time, right? Then plant him in front of the mirror, and he'll notice in the reflection this blob of paint. And chimps will typically put their hand up to their own forehead and think, what the hell's going on, you know? So clearly it understands that that's its own reflection. Gorillas are a bit more iffy about this. They will perhaps argue with the reflection a bit. Cats do that as well. They don't get that it's themselves. Elephants do. I think dolphins do, but most other creatures don't pass that test. I say pass it. I personally find it hard to see that as a test of consciousness. It's more a test of understanding what mirrors are, if you ask me. Because I vaguely remember as a child experimenting with mirrors, seeing if the reflection moved the same when I move my hands? Does the reflection do the same? And could I outwit it somehow? So I was conscious, you know, assuming we all are, assuming I am, certainly. So it's a funny test, if you ask me. I've always felt it as a bit of a poor test of consciousness. There are others, but you can kind of infer some fairly sophisticated viewpoint in those creatures that do recognise themselves in a reflection. They have some sort of sense of their own body and its movements and can correlate them with what they see. So there's some sophisticated processing going on. I'm dubious that it's a test of consciousness personally. I don't get it. Maybe you can explain in the comments why that's a test of consciousness, given that we can't measure it directly, of course. A better measure, I think, is testing that the creatures have a model or concept of other minds, that other creatures are like themselves in some way. So, for example, the scrubber jay, if it hides some food away, because they store food for later, okay, so they will bury a bit of food somewhere. But if they see that they are being observed by another scrub jay, they will sneak back later and move the food to somewhere else, unless the one who was observing them was their mate. So they know, okay, in some sense, that these other minds are independent. Now, one of the features of autism in humans is supposed to be that that autistics don't have a model of other minds, but I would have thought that they could do that sort of thing too, where it, you know, in their behaviour pattern to bury their food. All right. So maybe I'm puzzled about autism. I don't know. Obviously, I'm talking about high functioning autistics. So that test, anyway, which some animals do, kind of indicates that they have an understanding of creatures as independent entities. You might argue that it's just some sort of automated behaviour pattern that's evolved into them. I think it's always possible to argue that other creatures, including other humans, are not actually conscious and are just automata. But you have to, I think, apply a bit of common sense to it and draw the line at what's reasonable, what is a reasonable argument, and what's just pushing the boat out too far. So some biologists think that this is a measure of a fairly sophisticated, high degree of awareness of other beings. Another one is the ability to feel or demonstrate regret. Believe it or not, rats can feel regret, apparently. This has been measured or observed in experiments where they're trained to press levers to get rewards. And it's been observed that when a rat presses the wrong lever and doesn't get the reward, it will stare at the lever it should have pressed, as if expressing some regret. Oh, why didn't I do that, sort of thing. Which is quite interesting. Apparently they gaze kind of wistfully at the one that they should have pressed when they make a mistake. So that's definitely a sign of something going on beyond simply reacting to stuff. It's not reflexive actions, there's more sophisticated activity going on there. It's got some awareness of self, awareness of what might have been, that's quite amazing, really. And rats also show awareness of other beings as independent minds as well. They're very clever critters, of course, which is why they're so hard to exterminate, because they quickly learn to avoid the traps, no matter how sophisticated the traps are. Another test is that the animals show what are regarded as emotional responses to things, or as biologists try to call it neutrally, hedonic valuation. Things are good or bad in a biological sense. They're good for you or bad for you. And so, for example, most animals will show stress when handled by humans. Dogs and cats don't, obviously, because they're used to us and they like us. Or at least dogs do. Cats may be a bit more neutral. And when you pick up, say, a bird or something, its heart will race, its temperature will increase, things like that. It's evaluating the situation as potentially harmful and bad, basically. And mammals, birds, and reptiles do this. But, for example, fish and amphibians don't. They seem to react purely reflexively, without valuing it or regarding it as positive or negative, or having any regard for it as such. So there is some sort of emotional consciousness in mammals, birds, and reptiles. Mammals being the warm-blooded animals, basically. But fish and amphibians, nope. It's just a circumstance to them. And they may try to escape, but they don't have this kind of response to it. Some biologists say, well, why would this be so? And the thinking about it is that the emotional response allows for more flexible decision making. You're not just reacting to the situation, you are evaluating it as well on some level, because an emotion, even a human, is kind of a value judgment about things. They are largely based on good-bad dichotomies, and so it's slower because you go through this second level of processing. But on the other hand, assuming you survive, it provides greater flexibility in your decision making, and is therefore better for you in the long run because you can handle more sophisticated situations. And the biologists think that the creatures who came out of the water needed that because the environment was a lot tougher on land than in the sea. Greater temperature variations, I don't know what else. Harsh conditions, perhaps, on the whole. And it favoured more flexible decision making. I think life is more complicated on land generally, so you need to be able to be a bit more careful the way you decide on things. Simple reflexes work, though, for the simple creatures. They're still around. Some people say that consciousness is really all about subjective experience, and I would agree with that. That's the whole point, from my point of view, from a human point of view. But of course you can't measure subjective experience, so biologists measure a proxy, which is selective attention. The idea is if you're having a subjective experience, then you are choosing what to, or you can choose what to pay attention to out of the various things that are in your field of perception. And I was reading about one biologist who did experiments on flies. Okay, so he trained them to walk on a trackball and rotate it, and it would rotate as they walked on it, and he put electrodes in their brains. It's not very pleasant for them, I'm sure, but and it would show them LED lights flickering at different frequencies, so he could tell which ones they were paying attention to by the fact that their brains would resonate at the same frequency as the one they were paying attention to. And indeed, they were able to shift attention between one or the other as suited themselves, which is quite interesting. They have some sort of executive control over their attention. And it's this executive control, this extra layer. Well, I think in humans there's multiple extra layers. All of these extra layers exist in humans. But even flies have some ability to choose what's more important to pay attention to. Interestingly, jellyfish, worms, and I think octopuses don't show this feature. On the other hand, no, jellyfish and worms don't. That's right. So they don't have selective attention. That's not surprising, I think, in the case of jellyfish. Really, somehow, I'm not even clear that they've got a brain. Anyway, especially the transparent ones. Where is it? I don't know. Is it transparent as well? I don't know. Because selective attention is hard to measure, what has been noticed is that those creatures that have selective attention ability are also the ones that need to sleep. So that's vertebrates, all the creatures with backbones, including fish, insects, crustaceans, i.e. lobsters and crabs and stuff, and octopuses. And I presume that also includes fish and crustaceans, or fish and amphibians, who don't have the other sort, the emotional responses, but they do have this sort, the selective attention, or if you like, the ability to sleep, or the need to sleep. Why that is so, I don't know why there's a connection there. The other thing that's been noticed is that all the creatures that need to sleep respond well to general anaesthetics. They can be knocked out easily. Whereas the creatures that don't, like jellyfish and worms, are very hard to knock out with general anaesthetics. You have to use much, much higher doses, like 10 times higher doses, to knock them out, or to stop them moving. It probably doesn't knock them out as such because they don't have this consciousness type in the first place, probably. And the other thing that they look for, scientists look for to try and discern whether creatures are conscious or not, is what they call unlimited associative learning. This is the capacity to compound a whole series of cues into a single perceptual, or a single perception, if you like, a single experience, so that various things might be going on, but you see it as a single event, as it were. The example they gave was a dog growling might be a threat in one circumstance, but in another circumstance the dog is just playing and making growling noises, because they do, okay. Now a reflex creature, like a frog or something, wouldn't be able to tell the difference. It would just react to the growling as, oh, bad, get out of here, you know. Something like that. Apparently the reflex creatures can learn more complicated responses, but only by trial and error. And then they still only really have one response to the situation. Whereas the ability to put your perceptions into a wider context, like this, is something that actually a surprising number of creatures appear to be able to do. Vertebrates, again, all the creatures with backbones. Insects, believe it or not. Crustaceans, octopuses, and even some snails, apparently. So, this tells us that some forms of consciousness are widespread throughout the animal kingdom, mainly in the land animals, of all sorts, including the insects who came out of the sea first, which is quite something, really, especially for little critters like that. And yet we treat animals so badly, of course. Well, we treat other people badly too, actually, given, you know, look at human history. Look at the 20th century, 100 million people murdered by other humans. Mostly in the communist states, it has to be said, but still. And of course, hundreds of millions, billions of animals killed by us. Admittedly, we are predators and we do eat them. To me, that's a kind of an excuse. I eat them too. I would like them to die humanely. I would like them to have a happy life and then die suddenly without really knowing about it. That's not the way it's done. But that's how if it's going to happen, I would like it to happen like that. But even better, it'd probably be better to grow meat in a vat and just eat artificial, or if you like, grown meat. However, there's a big problem with that. If we start eating artificial meat, or vat-grown meat, test tube meat, I'm sure people complain that it's, you know, Frankenstein's meat or something. Like the Franken genes of, you know, but my problem isn't that. I'm sure it'll be healthy enough to eat, at least after a few, you know, scandals. My problem is that then all the creatures that we are keeping alive in order to eat, we will no longer need them, and their numbers will plummet from billions of cows. They will drop to a few million, probably. I mean, it has been proposed that we should eat more kangaroo and creatures like that, because that helps preserve them against extinction if we're farming them deliberately. Of course, a better way to do it is to set up huge nature reserves. I think Agenda 21, the United Nations thing, discusses rewilding the land a lot. We don't really have the time to do it, to be honest. I think we're going to face a lot of extinctions over the next few years, and actually seriously starting in about 20 years' time, in large numbers. I might talk about that again at some point. But let me know what you think about consciousness and animal consciousness, and does it have any consequences for our behaviour and the way we treat animals? I think they are still regarded as an industrial resource, and we do have to eat. It's more efficient to eat vegetables in terms of farming and pollution, but it's less efficient as a food for humans. I mean, it's theorised that we got our big brains partly because we had the fuel for it from meat. But then again, we cook food now, which helps as well. It releases more vitamins and minerals and stuff. It destroys a load too, and it releases more at the same time. So, what do we do? I mean, I treat animals nicely when I can, except, you know, mosquitoes and stuff. They may be conscious enough to pay attention to the fly swatter. That's up to them. Right. Okay then. Thoughts below. Bye for now.